Okay, so today we're diving straight into the Gaza hostage crisis.
Yeah.
And as you know, this is a story with
Yeah.
just tons of tension and honestly just a lot of heartbreak, a lot of uncertainty. And we've got reports coming in from all sides. We're seeing breaking news, expert analysis, and probably most importantly, we're hearing from the families who are right in the thick of this whole thing.
Absolutely. And I think what's really striking is you have this ceasefire that's just barely holding on by a thread, right? I mean, it was supposed to bring some relief, a chance for peace, but instead what we're seeing is Israel and Hamas just trading accusations.
Yeah.
We've got President Trump issuing ultimatums, and we have families just desperately clinging to hope.
Exactly. And it's those families, that really make this whole crisis hit home for me.
Yeah.
We're hearing stories like that of Ruby Chen. Her son, Adhere, is an American-Israeli soldier.
Right.
And he's being held captive.
Yeah.
And she's been publicly, pleading with Prime Minister Netanyahu to make her son's safe return a top priority.
It's just an agonizing situation, and you can absolutely understand why these families are so desperate, right? To have a loved one held captive, not knowing if they're safe, if they're ever going to come back.
Yeah.
And I think to understand how we even got here, you have to remember that Hamas, which is the Palestinian militant group that controls the Gaza Strip, took these hostages during the attacks on October 7th.
Yeah.
And so this current ceasefire agreement was a very hard-fought negotiation.
Yeah.
But a key part of this agreement was this phased release of hostages in exchange for the release of Palestinian prisoners held by Israel.
Okay, now when you say phased release, what does that mean exactly?
So phased release basically means the hostages are not all released at once. They're released in groups over a period of time.
Okay.
This approach was likely chosen to try to build some trust between the two sides.
Right.
So that each release is dependent on the other side, fulfilling their end of the agreement.
Okay.
Initially, the agreement was to free 33 hostages in this first phase.
Okay.
Which was, a glimmer of hope for these families who've just been living through this unimaginable agony.
And then as that hope was sort of building, it seems like it just got completely shattered.
It did.
Hamas just suddenly announced that they were delaying.
Out of the blue.
Yeah, the release of these 33 hostages. And they didn't even do it through official channels or anything. It was like a post on social media.
A social media post, which just adds to the chaos and confusion.
Right. Like, why would they do that? What's the point?
Well, their claim is that Israel is not holding up their end of the bargain.
Okay.
They're accusing Israel of a number of violations of these ceasefire terms, including things like delays in allowing displaced people to return to their homes in northern Gaza, continuing to target civilians, and not providing enough humanitarian aid.
So basically what they're saying is we're not releasing anybody until we get what we want.
Yeah, pretty much. Hamas is demanding what they call compensation from Israel.
Okay.
And they're essentially saying they want specific actions or concessions before they move forward with any further releases.
So what about those 33 hostages?
Yeah.
Where do they stand now?
Sadly, we've received confirmation that 8 of those hostages are dead.
Oh, wow.
And, for their families, the wait has just ended in the most heartbreaking way imaginable.
It's just devastating. And to think that all this is happening against this backdrop of a region that's already suffering so much.
Absolutely. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza just cannot be ignored.
Yeah.
We're talking about a region that has endured years of conflict, economic hardship.
Right.
And now the aftermath of these devastating attacks in October, the death toll from that conflict is estimated to be over 48,000.
Wow.
Which is more than the entire population of many cities.
Yeah.
And the living conditions for those who survived are extremely difficult.
So we have this fragile ceasefire.
Right.
Hostages whose lives are hanging in the balance. Families caught in this desperate limbo.
Yeah.
And a region struggling to cope with this massive humanitarian crisis.
Right.
I mean, it feels like we're at a breaking point here.
It does. The tension is palpable.
Yeah.
And then into this already volatile situation, you have President Trump.
Right.
And he throws in a major wild card.
Yeah, he issued a very stark warning.
He did.
To Hamas, giving them a deadline, a Saturday.
Yeah.
To release the hostages.
That's right.
And, I mean, he didn't mince words, did he? He said that if they don't comply, all hell will break out.
Strong words.
Yeah.
Very strong words.
So his involvement definitely raises the stakes.
It does.
But, I mean, is it a good thing or a bad thing?
I think that's what everybody's trying to figure out.
Yeah.
Right. Some believe that this ultimatum could actually force Hamas to release the hostages.
Okay.
That the threat of consequences will be enough to get them to comply.
Right.
But then you have others who fear that this very aggressive stance could completely backfire.
Yeah.
And potentially escalate the conflict.
Right, and make a peaceful resolution even harder.
Exactly.
So, okay, so Trump's involvement is a bit of a gamble.
It is.
What are people on the ground saying?
Yeah.
What are the reactions within Israel?
Well, it's a mixed bag, to be honest.
Okay.
You have figures on the far right like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir.
Okay.
Who are essentially echoing Trump's sentiments.
Right.
They're advocating for military action if Hamas doesn't release the hostages by the deadline.
Okay.
But then you have others who are very worried that Trump's approach is just too heavy-handed.
Right.
That it could jeopardize these already fragile negotiations.
Yeah.
And put the hostages at an even greater risk.
And how about those hostage families we were talking about before? How are they reacting to all this?
I mean, they're just caught in this impossible situation, right?
Yeah.
On one hand, they desperately want their loved ones to be released.
Right.
And they might actually see Trump's intervention as their last hope.
Right.
But on the other hand, they know that any escalation in violence could put their loved ones in even more danger.
Yeah.
So it's just a heart-wrenching dilemma.
And this isn't the first time that Trump has proposed a bold and some might say unorthodox approach to this conflict, right?
Right.
Earlier this month, he suggested that the U.S. could take over Gaza.
Yeah.
You know, his idea was to demolish the existing structures and relocate Palestinians to other countries like Egypt and Jordan.
Yeah, and that idea was met with, let's just say, less than enthusiastic responses.
Right.
Yeah, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
Hamas, other Middle Eastern countries, even some people within Israel condemned the idea.
Right. They saw it as unrealistic, impractical, potentially even more destabilizing.
Absolutely.
And I imagine that those hostage families, as desperate as they are, probably weren't too keen on that idea either.
Probably not.
I mean, they probably saw it as a distraction from the immediate goal of getting their loved ones back.
Right.
And they're probably worried that such a drastic move would just derail the negotiations and make the situation even more unpredictable.
Absolutely.
So we've got Hamas accusing Israel of breaking the ceasefire agreement.
Right.
We've got President Trump issuing ultimatums and suggesting these really radical solutions.
Yeah.
And we have families just desperately clinging to hope of seeing their loved ones again.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's just an incredibly tense and complicated situation.
It is.
With a lot of moving parts and really no easy answers.
Yeah, and I think as we move forward, it's important to keep in mind the broader context of this conflict.
Yeah.
We can't just focus on this immediate crisis. Right. But we need to understand the historical grievances, the political dynamics, and the human stories that have shaped this conflict over decades.
Yeah, you're right. There's a much bigger picture here.
There is.
And it's a picture we need to explore further.
Yes.
To truly understand the complexities of this Gaza hostage crisis.
Absolutely.
It's so easy to get caught up in all the political back and forth.
Yeah.
But I think it's so important to remember the people at the heart of this crisis.
Right.
You know, their lives have been totally upended.
Absolutely. We can't lose sight of the human cost of this conflict.
Yeah.
You know, the hostages, their families.
Right.
The people just living in Gaza. They're not just pawns in some kind of geopolitical game, you know.
Right.
These are individuals with hopes and dreams, and their lives are hanging in the balance.
Yeah. And for the families of these hostages, that balance feels so precarious right now.
It does.
You know, they're doing everything they can to be heard, demanding that the government make their loved ones release the priority.
Yeah, they're staging protests, blocking highways, anything to get attention. You can hear the desperation in their voices.
Yeah, and there was one quote from a family member, a hero. His uncle tragically died while he was being held captive in Gaza, and he said, "We can't afford another arm wrestling between the sides."
Wow.
There's a deal, go for it.
Yeah.
You know, it just highlights this urgency.
It does.
This plea to seize the opportunity, this fragile opportunity for peace.
Yeah.
Before it's too late.
That's such a powerful statement. And, you know, it really just captures the feelings of so many families caught in this limbo.
Yeah.
They're just clinging to hope.
Right.
that the ceasefire will hold, that negotiations will succeed, that their loved ones will come home.
So can this ceasefire actually survive? With all the accusations and the ultimatums and the delays, feels like it's about to collapse.
It is incredibly fragile. And if it does fall apart, the consequences could be catastrophic. Not just for the hostages, but for the entire region.
We're not just talking about the lives of the people being held captive.
No.
I mean, the collapse of the ceasefire could trigger a wider conflict.
It could.
Leading to more violence and suffering.
Absolutely. And we're talking about a region that's already dealing with this terrible humanitarian crisis. A return to a full-blown conflict would just make the suffering worse. I mean, the international community is watching this so closely. Urging both sides to show some restraint. And, try to find a way to move forward.
And we've seen the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, actively involved urging Hamas to continue with the hostage releases. And emphasizing this need to, avoid going back to war.
Absolutely.
But I mean, can diplomacy actually work? I mean, it's such a volatile environment with so many different players, so many competing interests, and so much distrust.
It is a very challenging situation, there's no doubt. But diplomacy is often the only way to break through these conflicts that seem so intractable. And it takes a lot of patience, a lot of persistence, and a real willingness to listen and to understand all sides.
And it's not just Israel and Hamas at the negotiating table.
No, it's not.
You've got the U.S. with President Trump, sort of inserting himself into it. And then you have other regional players like Egypt and Jordan, who have already said they won't do Trump's plan to resettle Gazans. It's just this tangled web of international relations.
It is.
And it's all converging on this tiny strip of land.
It is a reminder that this conflict doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's very deeply intertwined with all these regional dynamics and these geopolitical power struggles and these historical grievances that just span generations.
You really have to consider all these factors to understand what's happening in Gaza.
Absolutely.
It's like this giant chessboard where every move can tip the balance. And it's easy to forget that real people are caught in the middle of all this.
That's why it's so crucial to keep the human dimension in mind. These aren't just abstract political issues. These are matters of life and death. Families torn apart. Communities struggling to survive.
So where do we go from here? What are the potential outcomes of all this? And what does this mean for peace in the region? I mean, even if they release all the hostages and the ceasefire holds, all those underlying issues that caused this conflict are still there.
You're absolutely right. We're dealing with decades of mistrust, animosity, and all these unresolved issues like land, borders, security, the status of Jerusalem.
It's complicated.
Incredibly complex, emotionally charged issues that have just fueled this conflict for far too long.
So even if we get through this crisis, the potential for another one is still there.
That's the unfortunate reality. And that's why finding a lasting solution takes more than just a ceasefire. It really demands addressing those root causes of the conflict, fostering this understanding and empathy between Israelis and Palestinians, and building a future where both sides can actually live in security and with dignity.
It sounds like a monumental task.
It is.
One that's just eluded peacemakers for generations.
It certainly has. But it's a task that we cannot give up on. The stakes are just too high. And the human cost of doing nothing is just too great. We owe it to the people caught in the middle to keep striving for a just and lasting peace.
All right, so we've talked about this fragile ceasefire and the humanitarian crisis and just the incredibly high stakes involved in this whole conflict. But where do we go from here?
What are the potential outcomes? And what could this all mean for the future of the region?
Well, let's think about the different scenarios that could happen.
Okay.
In the best case scenario, Hamas may be facing pressure from the international community, or even just fearing what Trump might do, decides to release the rest of the hostages by Saturday.
That would be huge.
It would be.
Not just for those families who are waiting, but also for the hope of a lasting ceasefire.
Exactly. A successful hostage release could build some trust, however fragile, and could open the door for more talks between Israel and Hamas.
But let's be realistic. There's a chance that Hamas won't budge.
Yeah.
I mean, they've already shown they're willing to use the hostages as leverage.
Right.
So what if they just refuse to meet Trump's deadline?
I mean, that's the nightmare scenario.
Yeah.
If Hamas just ignores the ultimatum.
Right.
Trump might feel like he has to do something.
Which could lead to more military action.
Right. And as we talked about, that could be really bad for everyone.
Yeah, more violence, more casualties.
Right.
The hostages caught in the middle.
A terrifying thought. But is there like a middle ground? Like, are there other possibilities?
Sure. One possibility is that Hamas agrees to release some hostages.
Okay.
As like a show of good faith.
Okay.
But not all of them. They could try to drag out the negotiations and use the rest of the hostages to get more from Israel.
So like a partial win, but it wouldn't really fix anything?
Right. It wouldn't solve those underlying tensions.
Exactly. So what else?
Well, another possibility is that someone else steps in,
okay,
like Egypt or Qatar, to try to work out a compromise.
Okay.
They could offer Hamas some guarantees or pressure Israel to make some concessions in exchange for releasing the hostages.
So many moving parts, so much uncertainty.
Yeah.
But even if all the hostages are released and this ceasefire holds, the problems that started this are still there.
You're right.
It's complicated.
It is. We're talking about land, borders, security, Jerusalem.
Right.
These are really complex issues that have been fueling the conflict for a long time.
So even if we get through this, another conflict could happen.
That's true. And finding lasting peace needs more than just a ceasefire.
Right.
It means addressing those root causes.
Yeah.
Helping Israelis and Palestinians to understand each other.
Right.
And building a future where they can both live in peace.
It's a huge task.
It is a huge task.
And it's one that's been really hard to achieve.
It has.
But the cost of this conflict is too high to ignore.
That's right.
We can't give up on trying to find peace.
No matter how hard it seems.
And to our listener, as you think about this really difficult situation, think about what it means to negotiate with Hamas.
Right.
How do we balance the need for security with human rights?
It's a tough question.
These are tough questions.
Yeah.
But they're questions we need to think about if we want a more peaceful future.
For everyone.
In the region. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.